From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It began with 6 influential men travelling in secret to a private island. They used only their first names and travelled there separately so that they wouldn't be spotted. That secret meeting on Jekyll Island in Georgia in 1910 between a senator and a group of bankers laid the foundations for what became the Federal Reserve.
The Federal Reserve, in really simple terms, is the US's central bank. So it's the equivalent of the Bank of England or the European Central Bank.
Back in 1913, when the Fed was first established, it was trying to combat financial panics in the markets and control how money flowed through the economy. Now, that tends to mean focusing on one thing.
A central bank mainly has one proper job, which is to monitor inflation in the economy and to use its main tool, interest rates, to make sure inflation is not too low and it's not too high. The targets that most central banks have is 2%. That is the sweet spot.
Unlike other central banks, though, the Fed doesn't just try to keep inflation in America in check. It has a global impact. After all, when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold.
So when you're the central bank of the world's largest economy with the world reserve currency, you take on a kind of policeman role for the world's financial stability.
From the moment it was conceived, those 6 men on Jekyll Island knew that the Federal Reserve would have to be independent of the president for it to work and for the market to have confidence in it. Which is why, more than a century later, the financial world was stunned when President Trump published a letter on Truth Social on Tuesday, firing one of the governors of the Fed.
In an unprecedented move, President Trump announced he is firing Fed Governor Lisa Cook over allegations of mortgage fraud. This is the first time a president has fired a Fed governor in the central bank's 111-year history.
Most of us hadn't even heard of Lisa Cook even a week ago, but her sacking by President Trump could have an impact on us all. So why is he trying to sack her? How will the markets respond to the president interfering with the Fed? And could America be heading for an economic meltdown? The story today, why Trump's attack on the Fed affects us all.
My name's Mehreen Khan. I'm the economics editor at The Times.
And how much is this story something you're having to watch every moment?
Surprisingly much more than I anticipated, and I imagine anyone else who was on sort of Fed watch anticipated. So when Donald Trump was elected, there are all these potential questions that were asked. What's this going to mean for the global economy? What are the tariffs going to do? And there was always this other thing of like, what's the relationship going to be like between the Federal Reserve, the US independent central bank, and the president? And most of that attention was just about the guy who runs the central bank, Jerome Powell. He's the chairman. And most of our questions were about, will he fire him? Will he appoint his successor early? Et cetera, et cetera. And that has been the main kind of psychodrama surrounding President Trump and the Federal Reserve. It's been about the head of the central bank, the person probably most Americans recognize. But what we're talking about now, I think, is much more pernicious, because what's happening is that the assault on the Fed isn't just on the person running it. It's actually on the real institution, which is the Monetary Policy Committee. So this group of policymakers who all decide what interest rates are. And the story we're going to be talking about is about Lisa Cook, who I will admit is not someone I really knew much about, because I don't really know who Fed governors are. Like most people, I know about Powell and a couple of others that do speeches, but she has emerged, I think, as a real lightning rod for this bigger question, not just about the independence of the Fed, but actually just about, I think, the slow erosion of all forms of technocratic or independent democratic bodies in the United States. With the interesting thing that the Fed is not just important for Americans, it's probably much more important for us in the rest of the world as it is for Americans because of the power of the institution. I would say it's probably the most powerful financial institution in the world.
As you say, when Donald Trump came in, there were already questions being asked about the Fed. During his campaign, he'd often criticised Jerome Powell. He has carried on doing that through his time in office so far. Just talk us through that. Why was he making Jerome Powell a target?
In some ways, Jerome Powell is not very exceptional, but is also very exceptional. Why is he not exceptional? Because Donald Trump has a storied history now, of going after relatively independent civil servant type figures that are not necessarily singing from his same hymn sheet. Anyone who sort of shows any degree of resistance, or at least is not a full-blown acolyte of the Trumpian worldview, is probably at some point going to be in the crosshairs of Donald Trump. Now, what's exceptional is that Jerome Powell or Fed policymakers are not just like other civil servants. They're not just like other federal government workers. They have an extra level of protection from political interference because they're central bankers and have this unique, I think, sanctity around them, where the whole point is that we've decided that these guys are so important and their job is so important is that we don't let politics touch them. So they are supposed to be protected from all forms of political interference, which is why we don't have the Prime Minister in this country telling Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, what to do. We've really taken this principle that they should be isolated from politics. Why? Because the job that they do, which is to manage demand or inflation in the economy, should not be subject to political cycles. So we shouldn't be in a place where the Bank of England is under pressure to cut interest rates before an election to help said incumbent Prime Minister or President. And we also shouldn't be in a place where they could raise interest rates in a way to perhaps serve some other sort of political goal. So this interest rate thing is so important that we've decided that they should be outside of the realm of political speculation. Donald Trump has shown absolutely no respect for this principle. No, Donald Trump has become the first president, I think, in more than 20 years to actually visit the Federal Reserve's physical premises. He went there. Now, that's the degree to which the independence is taken seriously, that no president for the last 2 decades has even gone to the Fed's building.
In a very physical sense, this is breathing down his neck.
He had a press conference, a whole load of cameras, and stood next to Jerome Powell and was sort of, being obviously intimidating to him.
How did that go?
It's perhaps one of the most awkward encounters I've ever seen between perhaps the two most important economic authorities in the world. And they're engaged in this bizarre passive-aggressive exchange over the fact that Trump has accused Powell of overseeing the renovation of the Fed's buildings, which is being run over cost. And he's basically saying that you've just burnt this money and, where's this money gone? And Powell is sort of there trying to sort of just say, look, nothing has been wasted. Everything is kind of fine. This is to use a pun, a trumped-up charge. But yeah, it's a very awkward encounter.
So we're taking a look, and it looks like it's about 3.1 billion. It went up a little bit, or a lot. So the 2.7 is now 3.1.
I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it just came out.
Yeah, I haven't heard that from anybody at the Fed.
Yeah, it just came out.
I've literally never seen anything like it. I think for most people, they just would think, oh, it's just Trump being Trump. But I think in my sort of world, it's just so weird to see this.
You're including the Martin renovation. You just added our entire capital. Yeah, you just added in a third building. Is what that is. That's a third building, including the Martin building.
It's a building that's being built.
No, it was built 5 years ago. We finished Martin 5 years ago.
And like the boundaries of whatever we thought was acceptable have been pushed so far by Donald Trump, and the Fed is perhaps probably the most important example of how that's playing out.
And Mehreen, you obviously watch this very closely. Just stepping back, why is Donald Trump so keen to influence Jerome Powell? I mean, we've talked before about the difference between what was really happening in the American economy and the vibes. How much does Jerome Powell control the vibes?
I think he may be the CEO of vibes. He is the vibe master, not just for Americans, but for us. So in a way,
great title.
It is a recognition of the power of the Fed, the degree to which Trump has targeted this institution. So what does Donald Trump want? In a really simple way, he wants lower interest rates. And that's quite normal for most politicians in office to want lower interest rates during their terms, because lower interest rates will soup up an economy. It will, as I said, lower the cost of borrowing, make people happy about their spending, allow companies to invest, to hire people. It will stimulate demand in an economy and boost those growth rates that are so important.
I guess, in a way that people here would understand, you feel like you have more money at the end of the month because your mortgages are cheaper.
And the government pays less to service its own debt. So it lowers the rate of the government's borrowing. And by lowering the rate of the government's borrowing, that means Donald Trump can pay for all of those tax cuts in his big, beautiful bill. So there's many, many benefits to having low interest rates. And having low interest rates is all well and good. But then having low interest rates with high inflation is exactly the kind of territory you don't want to be going into as a central bank.
So tell us about that. So if you were Jerome Powell, what is it that he's seeing that would make him worry that inflation could be about to get worse and he should actually be trying to raise interest rates a bit or keep them high because the pressure's mounting?
One word, and it's Donald Trump's favourite word, tariffs.
We can't escape them.
It is all about tariffs. So in 2025, the Federal Reserve has not cut interest rates. They had cut them a couple of times in 2024, but since Trump has been president, there's been no change to America's borrowing costs, which are at 4.25 to 4.5%. But there's this whole tariff speculation. So we don't know what they're going to be. From April, they change and then they change again. And then we have, a pause and another 90-day, whatever. So there is this looming tariff question. And the economics textbooks would say that if you are going to have the degree of protectionism that Donald Trump has announced, which will be the highest in nearly 100 years for the American economy, the cost of those import taxes, which he's applying on foreign goods, will ultimately be borne by American consumers because companies will deal with this extra tax by passing it on to consumers. So the cost of stuff that you buy from abroad will get more expensive, and that's basically inflation. That's just how inflation works.
Yeah, you will notice the prices going up around you, and it's because of tariffs.
And it will be reasonably generalized phenomenon because it will be across all types of goods. I mean, there are very few exceptions to Donald Trump's tariffs. And when you have a huge part of the economy, the goods part of the economy, which is subject to tariffs, that can then spread out into all other parts of the economy. Then people want to have slightly higher wages to compensate for the fact that everything's getting more expensive in the shops. Some companies will also take advantage of the fact that there's more inflation around by also lifting their prices just because they can. So this is a phenomena of sort of generalized inflation. You could probably say, I think in the rough ballpark, 1 to 2 percentage points of inflation. That doesn't sound like a lot, but the US has also just come out of a period of very high inflation since 2022 onwards. And we know that inflation has been a terribly painful experience for Americans. One of the reasons we spoke so much about the vibes was that even though inflation has been quite low, prices of things like, the egg issue in the US is just really painful for people. And Donald Trump promised to bring these prices down. He didn't just promise to stop the inflation. He was like, I'm going to deflate these prices. Your egg price is going to go back to what they were in 2019. And so this creates a difficulty for the Fed because they're waiting for this tariff thing to settle and then they're waiting for the inflation impact. And the waiting is the thing that's really killing Donald Trump because he's like, you've got to cut interest rates now.
Yeah.
You have to support the labour market now because the labour market is slowing. The economy is slowing, partly because of Donald Trump's policies. So he wants immediate interest rate cuts, whereas the Fed, a majority of them have been like, just give us a bit more time. Yes, we think they're going to come down, but we just need to really get a grip on the data that's coming in about where people are going to feel the pinch on inflation because they don't want to be in a position where inflation is rising and they're cutting interest rates. That's the nightmare scenario for all central bankers.
So there's a great irony here. This is, as you say, Trump's favourite word, tariffs. This is the great economic policy he's sort of pinning his colours to. And yet that's one of the reasons the Fed can't really lower interest rates at the moment. And they can see that there is an effect on the economy. Jobs are slowing, but there's not much they can do about it. There is a debate, we should say, there is a debate amongst economists about whether they should have reduced interest rates faster. Some people would criticise Jerome Powell for not doing it. But through all of this, everybody's watching Donald Trump tweeting and ranting about Jerome Powell. Nobody's looking, as you said earlier, at the institution itself. That's where he actually has been making a difference. Talk us through that.
Yeah, the Fed is a weird institution, and I've been learning much more about how it works. It is an independent central bank. And one of the ways the Fed is able to insulate itself from political interference is by doing things by having people with really long terms. The Fed is divided into two main bodies. One is the main interest rate committee. It's got 12 people on it. They're called the FOMC. And within that 12, there's a special batch of 7 who are called governors. That includes Jerome Powell. It includes Lisa Cook, who we're going to be talking about. And these 7 have 14-year terms. So they can sit on the Federal Reserve for 14 years. Now, in the US, that is 3 and a bit presidential terms. So you're really kind of really outlasting the political cycle. If you're going to take that seat for 14 years, it's one way to insulate you from any kind of political pressure because you're going to see presidents come and go, but you stay at the Federal Reserve. Most of these people are academic and academic economists. Some of them have worked perhaps sometimes in the private sector or on Wall Street. And it's their job collectively to decide by majority what interest rate should be every 6 weeks or so. That's how it works. It's also how it works in the Bank of England. We only have 9 folks on ours, but the majority usually wins out. And the chair is important, but the chair is only 1 vote.
Yeah.
So in a way, going after Jerome Powell has been very politically important for Donald Trump, but him and his advisors know that even if they get rid of Jerome Powell, it's still 1 vote. Now, if you really want to change the balance of views on the Federal Reserve, you need to find a way to get more of your allies into that 12-member body and also into that 7-member body. And that's the story that is playing out here with Lisa Cook, because Donald Trump, and if you looked at the calendar, there's just not that many seats that are going to become vacant on these 14-year terms.
Yeah.
There were very few abilities for him to say, oh, in 2027, this person goes and we can do that. No. And he has no patience for this. So what is he doing? I think the story of Lisa Cook is finding, I would say, a trumped-up political witch hunt against people on the Fed, and we'll talk about what the allegations are, as a way to either create a hostile environment that forces them to resign or to actually oust them or fire them to then get your people in.
And we should say he's already succeeded in taking a few seats on that body.
Yes, so in his first term, he appointed 2 members of the 7-member governing council, Michelle Bowman and Christopher Waller. These are 2 Trump appointees, and it's important to note that they are also the only 2 members of the Fed's committee that have been saying that we need low interest rates. Now, you can argue, is that them being Trump acolytes or is that their views of the economy? But I'm just putting it out there. And then unexpectedly, another member, Adriana Kugler, resigned a couple of weeks ago, unexpectedly early, and that created another vacancy. And Donald Trump filled it with actually one of his most senior economic advisors, Stephen Mehreen, who he says is going to take that spot temporarily, and he might even be there to vote in September. So Trump has realized that, sometimes people will resign, sometimes people will get sick, but maybe I can actually pick them off to be able to win little majorities. And if I get enough of my folks in, I can use them as a way to influence everyone else. And for me, the parallel is basically the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And we know this is how presidents deal with the Supreme Court. They pick judges who are going to be there for a long time and be able to shift the political balance so their political kind of fingerprints are left on the US legal system way after they've become president, way after they've left. So this is kind of like the Supreme Courtization of the Fed. And it's a really bizarre and weird new world.
Now that really does bring us on to the woman at the heart of this. A woman who most of us hadn't heard of even a week ago, Lisa Cook. Who is she? What do we know about her? And what was she doing?
So Lisa Cook is one of those 7 governors that I mentioned. So she's one of Jerome Powell's deputies. She was appointed by Joe Biden in 2022. She has a 14-year term. So her term doesn't technically expire until 2036. A long way away. And she's an economist. She has a PhD in economics. She's taught at places like Harvard. She advised the Obama administration. I think she has some specialists in international economics, including Russia. And she's done a lot of work on how African Americans experienced the Jim Crow period economically. So she's done a lot of work, I think, in these types of areas, which are important to stress because these are exactly the sort of academic areas that people like Donald Trump would say is woke nonsense or DEI. It's also important to note that she's the first African American woman to have ever served on the board of the Federal Reserve. And a couple of weeks ago, an allegation from the US's Federal Housing Authority, which is run by a Trump ally, emerged that Lisa Cook had taken out a couple of mortgages in 2021 within 6 weeks of each other, where she designated both properties as her principal residence. The allegation is that this is deliberate mortgage fraud, that she did this to deceive her bank to be able to get a lower interest rate on her mortgage. We should say at the time of speaking that there has been no follow-up criminal prosecution. The Department of Justice haven't taken this on as an example of deliberate fraud. I think in the grand scheme of things, this is being seen by Lisa Cook, who hasn't really denied the allegations, but just says there's no validity in this. And I don't think in the modern history of the Fed, any president has ever tried to fire a central banker over any type of malfeasance or criminal activity, let alone this one, which I think you could argue on merit whether it's a real example of a financial fraud or not.
He put out a letter in his usual very public way. It's gone out on social media. A letter saying she's been sacked. Why is there still uncertainty?
Yes. So it's just not clear, because I said this has never happened before, whether the president can fire a member of the Fed's governing board. And this is why this is going to go to court. So Lisa Cook has said that she's not going to resign. Her lawyers have said that this is all nonsense, that she will fight and she will, test the principles of central bank independence to destruction through the courts.
I am humbled and honored to have been nominated by President Biden to be a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. In terms of priorities, I agree with Chair Powell that our most important task is tackling inflation.
Donald Trump has said he's fired her effective immediately. We just don't know what's going to happen, for example, at the Fed's next meeting in September, whether Lisa Cook is going to be there, whether she can vote, whether the courts may have decided before then whether she has been fired or she can't be fired. We don't know what Jerome Powell, the guy who's technically her boss, thinks about all of this.
Yeah.
So we're just in a world of complete, I think, legal uncertainty. And throwing the Fed into this kind of legal uncertainty, I would say, has more consequences than throwing the Supreme Court into uncertainty, the Bureau of Labor Statistics into uncertainty, shutting down US aid, the Doge stuff, basically culling federal workers. This has all brought lots of uncertainty. But calling into question interest rate decisions from the Fed is just like, it's completely unprecedented. And you would expect at some point this will have major financial consequences for the United States and the trust people have in its currency and its bonds.
Well, Mehreen, tell us about that, because the one thing we all know is that markets don't love uncertainty. There is this uncertainty around already. They've seen a letter saying Lisa Cook's been sacked. They don't know if she's actually gone. There's a legal process hanging over all of this. How are the markets reacting?
They're kind of just like, meh. And I think it's because they don't understand. Yeah, everyone's sort of like,
What's just happened?
Yeah, so in that sense, there's no panic. Let's say we were in a world where Lisa Cook gets fired and the bond market goes haywire. What's going to happen? Donald Trump's going to be like, oh, whoops, maybe. And there will be a tactical retreat. This is exactly what happened after Liberation Day. The bond markets didn't like it. Then we get a 90-day pause. So the bond market has an important...
This is what we're now calling TACO, the markets call it. This is Trump always chickens out.
For him to chicken out, he needs to see the whites of the eyes of the bond market. Exactly.
He sees the market go mad.
There's been no blowback so far. And I think the danger is that the slow creep of the politicization of the Fed will happen in an incremental way. And the bond markets will perhaps only wake up to this danger when they see interest rates falling in the United States and inflation going up. I think they will need to see that direct dynamic for them to actually believe this is happening.
If they start to see those signs, they start to see inflation rising and they hear that interest rates are going down. If you were in the bond market, if you were one of those vigilantes, what's your thinking?
Then you enter this world of what economists love calling fiscal dominance. This is one of their favourite phrases.
Go on, give us another term for the glossary.
Fiscal dominance. Did you take that out? It's a family show.
No, we're going to keep economic S&M references in because
stick in people's heads more. This is how
they need livening up.
This is how we do it. Fiscal dominance is a situation where you have monetary policy which is subservient to political aims. That's what it is. The fiscal authority, in this case, the United States President, the White House, the Treasury, are able to dictate what interest rates should be based on their own metrics. Fiscal dominance is a normal part of kind of how investors have thought about risk when they invest in emerging markets, for example, in countries where the sort of separation of institutions isn't as strong. Turkey is one of the best examples of this, where President Erdogan has had a very firm grip on the country's central bank, and he's had them for a couple of years at least, or maybe even a decade now, to lower interest rates when inflation in the country is going gangbusters. That's fiscal dominance. And in a world of fiscal dominance, you get very worried about holding the assets of this country because you can no longer trust that their policymakers are going to do the right thing. The irony of Donald Trump wanting lower interest rates is that if he gets his lower interest rates in the way that he wants them through fiscal dominance, longer term interest rates in the United States will go up because the people holding those bonds, so foreign creditors, companies, pension funds, whatever, are going to sell those assets because they don't trust you anymore. And when they sell them, your borrowing costs go up. So it's a completely self-defeating strategy to get lower interest rates. And we kind of saw this dynamic play out a little bit in the UK when Liz Truss was Prime Minister and the long-term UK's borrowing costs were going up because people were really worried about the future of our debt and the deficit. And so Donald Trump is entering a world where he can control one variable, short-term interest rates in the Fed, but he can't control the rest of it.
So that's the market losing confidence in America's ability to pay that back.
Yeah, and they sell the dollar, so they weaken the American currency, which hits Americans' consumer purchasing power. When the dollar's weaker, inflation is going to get worse because the things that you're importing also then become more expensive. So you can see this kind of spiral. And, you know, it's going to be a very puzzling environment for Americans to understand what's going on, and for the rest of us who are just going to be affected by what could potentially just end up in a financial crisis, actually.
Stepping back, this is not the first time you've had the Fed being lent on by a president. Take us back to the 1970s. President Nixon is in power. Not the finest moment for America. Tell us about a man named Arthur Burns.
Yeah. So I think most central bankers, if you ask them who's the kind of central banker you never want to be associated with, they all say poor Arthur Burns.
Ah.
Yeah. In 1969, President Nixon announces that his friend, Arthur Burns, a very highly esteemed economist who he worked with in the Eisenhower administration, is going to be running the Federal Reserve starting in, I think, February the 1st, 1970. The sort of inauguration of Arthur Burns happens and Nixon is standing next to him. And Nixon is making some comments about how he thinks that Arthur Burns is going to do the right thing by lowering US interest rates. And he says, Arthur, the Fed is independent and you will independently arrive at this judgment that it's time to cut interest rates.
Oh,
so
no.
It's clear. I mean, this is Trumpian, right?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
This doesn't sound very independent
It doesn't at all. And Arthur Burns has gone down in history as the worst central banker of all time, because history has told us that Arthur Burns was put under political pressure by his friend Richard Nixon to cut interest rates to support Nixon during his re-election campaign at a time when inflation was going up in the United States. And the 70s, as that decade evolves, becomes one of the most painful periods in recent economic history for the United States, because it's a period where inflation goes to double digits and where there is a prolonged recession basically throughout the decade, which only really resolves itself in the mid-80s, long after Arthur Burns is gone. And Arthur Burns, and he's written about this in letters that have since been published, about what a difficult time he had because Nixon was really on his head. And he was really worried that the societal consequences of having high interest rates in a period where, the civil rights movement is also dividing America, where the Vietnam War has intergenerationally, split Americans apart, and where high interest rates will also hurt the banking system and potentially lead to another version of the Great Depression. He's weighing all these factors up. And eventually you end up in a period where, yes, US monetary policy is too loose. Inflation gets to about 10 to 11%. Interest rates are not high enough. And the inflation phenomena, which starts at the beginning of the 70s, basically carries on throughout the entire decade. And I think the reason that Arthur Burns goes down as history as the worst central bank of all time is the guy who came after him did exactly the opposite, a man called Paul Volcker. Now, he really hates inflation to the point where he spends the next 4 or 5 years yanking up US interest rates almost as high as 16%, causing prolonged deep recessions to suck that inflation out of the economy. Now, all central bankers today love Paul Volcker, and they don't want to be anything like Arthur Burns. I think history is a bit more complicated. It's a very sad state of affairs. But that's the sort of binary world of central bankers. They're like, you've got an inflation problem, you assert your independence by basically going for it, killing the inflation, and you don't worry about social consequences.
Are there fears in America? I mean, at the moment the economy seems to be okay, but you do hear economists talk about this. Stagflation is something we haven't talked about since about the 70s. Lots of things from the 70s seem to be making a comeback. We've had France going to the IMF, people thinking we might have to. Yes, there are dangers of people doing things that we didn't think was possible this side of the disco revolution. I mean, is there a chance that stagflation could be back in America?
So I'm usually a bit of a hater when it comes to 70s comparisons, because I think too many of people in our economic policy making, and potentially even the media, were around in the 70s, and it's basically their only playbook for how economics works. And I think history may, rhyme, but it rarely repeats. However, having said that, I think stagflation in the United States, because of this bigger issue of fiscal dominance, has to be a real possibility. Stagflation is just an amalgam of two words: stagnation, so stagnant economic growth, and inflation, and usually high inflation. So that's the nightmare situation for all central bankers. You don't want to be in a position where inflation is going up and your economy is not growing. Now, it's interesting because we're talking at a time where the Fed's probably going to cut interest rates in September, and they were probably going to do that anyway before of all of this kind of drama around Lisa Cook. And then the question becomes, how far do you cut interest rates? And then the other big question is, where is inflation going? So these are the two most important data points. And I think now everyone in financial markets and economists are going to be watching two things. Any signs that inflation is increasing in the United States? We haven't seen so much of it so far. The so-called tariff pass-through hasn't happened yet, but it's very likely to happen. And then whether the Fed just cuts once or maybe twice and then holds it there, or whether they go on a sustained period of monetary easing as data shows that inflation is rising. That's panic stations. That's when I think the bond market will react. That's when I think the currency market will react. They literally need to see this happen for them to respond. And I think the problem is by the time they respond, it could be too late. So Lisa Cook may have been gone. Her appointment may have been already announced. Jerome Powell, his term is going to come up in 2026. He may also choose to leave the governing board. He doesn't have to, so that's another seat. That gives Donald Trump 5 out of 7 members of the most important body of the Federal Reserve. They also have the appointment to pick other members of the Federal Reserve. So by the middle of next year, you could get a sense in which the institution has just become very politicized, almost by stealth overnight. And most of us were sort of worried, but not worried enough. And now we're in a world where he's got control of the Federal Reserve and all of his lackeys are in the Federal Reserve and they're just determined to cut interest rates because intellectually that's the thing they think is the right thing to do. So yes, I think stagflation, for the first time seriously, we really should be thinking about this phenomenon because there is a huge question about whether US monetary policy is now truly independent.
Wow. If that starts to happen, I mean, just describe how disastrous that would be for the American economy. How would people feel the impact?
Well, they'd have very, very high inflation. The value of their dollar would be worth less. Companies would probably be yanking out investment because they don't want to invest in a country where they cannot trust in the credibility of economic policy making. I think you're probably going to end up in a world where Donald Trump is going to produce his own set of economic statistics because we know that he has problems with official statistics when they show him things he doesn't like. Then you'd probably have his favored media organs reporting on said alternative facts. And Americans will probably find it really difficult to pass where responsibility lies, but they will be feeling cost of living pressures. Companies will be feeling cost of living pressures. The economy and the labor market, which has been relatively strong, like a lot of Americans have been staying in work, even if their wages haven't been rising in line often with prices, they have stayed in work. If you have a situation where there's such a cloud hanging over your ability to set the correct interest rates, then you do end up in a 1970s world. But I think it's worse. And the reason it's worse is because the Fed has also become that body that also underpins the global financial system, which was kind of true in the 70s, but just not as much as it's true now, where we have a world of financialized capitalism. And so how will lower interest rates just affect the US banking system or the so-called shadow banking system or private equity or venture capital? All of these financial linkages where the dollar is basically the most important asset that sort of undergirds the way the system works is important for Americans, but it's also going to be important for us.
Would we feel the impact here?
Well, let's say we get in a hypothetical world where there is a financial crisis outside the US economy, which involves a financial institution that made some bad bets. I went back to the 2008-2009 example where the Fed was there to give something called swap lines, which is basically they sign an agreement with another country's central bank to give them cheap dollars to help stem their panic. This level of cooperation has effectively often brought the world economy back from the brink of disaster.
Yeah.
If you're in a world where Donald Trump says, you, Mexico, can't get a swap line because you're not investing enough in the United States, and I'm going to put tariffs on all your goods, and I don't like the look of your government, and I want you to invest more in defense spending, say it's Europe, that Donald Trump could have the power to tell the Federal Reserve that they cannot offer that lifeline to another country at a time of financial stress. And that's, I think, even more important than the monetary policy conversation is if the Fed is being told that it cannot give, as I said, these sort of financial lifelines to countries that need them, then you basically sort of take out the world's policeman and you get into a much unruly, I think, darker, scarier environment where the rest of the world is going to have to work out how to run the financial system without the country that runs the financial system. Right? So the politicization of the Fed and all parts of economic policy making is really important for the rest of us because we just rely on them so much to often just do the right thing.
And Mehreen, that's always been the fear when we've expected America to be the financial policeman in order to make the markets work. The dollar is the reserve currency we all sort of rely on. Is this just another step in that no longer being the case?
I think so. It is about the erosion of any sense of independent checks and balances on executive power and on brazen, unaccountable executive power. And it's important diplomatically for the rest of us, as people in Europe are finding out with their conversations about defense spending and tariffs. It's important for Americans because they ultimately will have to bear the costs of an economy that could be in a slow-moving collapse. And it's important for the financial system, which is, we've just got City of London behind us, for Wall Street, because so many of our own assets, our mortgage prices, our house prices, we are connected to the financial system in ways we don't know, much more than just our bank accounts. And if there isn't that central actor, that hegemon that behaves in a relatively benevolent way, then we all have to try and find ways to work out a way to run the system without them. But the transition to that new world is also going to be incredibly painful. So it's almost hard to talk about what this would look like in some world, and because I'm sort of devising and imagining a world that
we've never had to think about.
We've never really had to think about. We take these things like the dollar swap lines or the ability to cut interest rates to support an economy when needed for granted. We've just taken these central bankers very much for granted, and especially the American ones. We've just trusted them implicitly. We trust their dollar. We trust our own currencies, which are based very much on theirs. And when that trust is being eroded, as it is in real time, then I find it hard to almost convey the gravity of the world that we could be in. But it just will entail, I think, a lot of pain for people who probably just won't understand why any of this is actually happening. It's hard for people to realize we could be in a world of so much financial stress because of the ideological whims of a very important person who happens to be the US president. So I think there will be a lot of soul searching. I think the way that we, report on these issues, the way that, how important it is for us to sort of understand why this is happening is going to be very important to communicate to people about, what potentially are the consequences of eroding an institution that you'd probably never heard of before today, which is the US Federal Reserve. But there we go.
That was the inimitable Mehreen Khan, economics editor at The Times. You can find all the latest coverage of the pressures on the Fed at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producer today was Shabnam Grewal. The executive producer was Edward Drummond. Sound design was by David Crackles, and the theme was composed by Mal Assetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.